Before anything else in this video, 2 American service members were killed in action this weekend, a third was killed separately in Iraq, and 1 more remains missing as of this recording. I want to say that plainly and clearly, right up front, without any dramatic music or flashy framing, because that's the actual human cost sitting underneath this headline, and it deserves to be said clearly before we get into any of the technical breakdown that follows in the rest of this video. Former combat fighter pilot here, years flying the F-15E in actual combat operations, time as a Thunderbird pilot, after that, years flying commercial jets, once my time in the fighter community wrapped up for good. I've spent a career around exactly this kind of weapons and defense system, and I want to walk you through what actually happened this weekend, why it happened, and what it tells us about a real measurable shift in this war, without losing sight of the fact that real people didn't come home because of it. Here's what's confirmed, laid out as plainly and carefully as I can put it together, from official statements and independently verified reporting. On the night of July 17th, Iran launched at least 2 ballistic missiles at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility that hosts American troops and fighter aircraft as part of the broader coalition presence maintained in the country. CENTCOM confirmed the following day that 2 American service members were killed in action while defending against that attack, along with Iranian drone strikes that were launched in that exact same window. A 3rd service member remains missing as of the most recent update, and CENTCOM said unidentified remains were later found at the site of the attack, still undergoing a formal identification process. 4 additional troops were also medically evacuated to Jordanian hospitals and have since been fully discharged. Separately, a U.S. service member was killed in Iraq during what was described as a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone. Taken together, that brings the total number of American military fatalities across this entire conflict to 17, with more than 430 service members wounded since the war began back in February. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth responded publicly to the news, saying their sacrifice only stiffens the country's resolve going forward. This marks the first confirmed American combat fatalities from Iranian fire since March, meaning it's been months since this particular war had directly claimed American lives in exactly this way up until this weekend. I also want to be careful here about something specific. CENTCOM said it will withhold the names of the fallen service members until 24 hours after their families have been formally notified. And I think that's exactly the right call, and it's exactly the standard I want to hold this video to as well. This isn't going to be a video that speculates about identities, units, or personal details that haven't been officially released. Those decisions belong to the families first, and to the official process second, not to any breakdown video trying to move quickly on a fast-developing story. I want to sit with that for a second before we move into the technical side of this, because I think it matters. This war has produced a lot of headlines about strikes, blockades, and negotiations over the past several months, and it's genuinely easy to talk about all of that in fairly abstract strategic terms. This weekend is a genuine, sobering reminder that underneath every one of those strategic headlines, there are real service members standing watch at real physical bases around the world, and sometimes the outcome of that is exactly what happened at Muwafaq Salti this weekend. Now let's get into the part of this story that I think explains why this particular attack succeeded in a way that previous ones largely hadn't, because that's genuinely the more complicated and important half of this headline. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, citing American officials directly, Iran has adapted its missile force specifically to defeat U.S. air defense systems, deploying weapons capable of extremely high speeds that can actively maneuver during their terminal descent phase, right in the final seconds before impact, specifically to complicate any attempt at interception. Let me actually explain what that means technically, because it's a genuinely important shift from how these systems used to work. A traditional ballistic missile follows a mostly predictable arc. It goes up, it comes down, and once you've tracked its launch and trajectory, an interceptor system like Patriot or THAAD can calculate roughly where it's going to be and put an interceptor in that exact spot. Iran's newer missiles, weapons like the Fatah-1 and its Fatah-2 derivative, are specifically engineered around a different concept, a maneuverable reentry vehicle, meaning the warhead itself can execute evasive movements during that final descent, well after a traditional intercept solution would have already been calculated and committed. The IRGC's own aerospace force has described the Fatah-1 as coming in from outside the atmosphere, at speeds exceeding Mach 10 before that detachable warhead starts actively dodging in the final seconds of flight, a profile that compresses a defender's entire engagement window down to just a handful of seconds. There's a specific vulnerability here worth explaining, because it's not just about speed, it's about the physics of how an interceptor actually corrects its own course. According to a post-conflict analysis from JINSA, following an earlier round of fighting last year, THAAD's hit-to-kill vehicles carry a limited divert budget, essentially a fixed amount of maneuvering fuel and thrust available to adjust course at the very last moment to actually collide with an incoming warhead. That divert budget is sized around intercepting a non-maneuvering, purely ballistic target. When a warhead like the Fatah executes an unpredictable evasive maneuver late in its flight, the interceptor's fire control system has to recalculate and correct in real time, and according to that same analysis, the interceptor's limited divert budget can get exhausted faster than the system can actually keep pace with the target's evasive movements. That's the core physics behind why a technically advanced, extremely expensive interceptor system can still miss an incoming warhead that's actively dodging in its final seconds. It's not a failure of the system's design, so much as a genuinely difficult physics problem that gets harder every time the incoming missile gets faster or more maneuverable. I want to give you a concrete way to picture this, because the raw physics description can be hard to visualize otherwise. Think about trying to catch a ball that's thrown directly at you on a predictable straight line. You can calculate exactly where your hand needs to be, well before it arrives. You've got plenty of time to adjust. Now imagine that same ball, but at the very last instant before it would have landed in your hand, it's suddenly juked sideways. Even if you're fast, even if you're skilled, that last second course correction is enormously harder than tracking a predictable straight line the entire way. That's roughly the difference between intercepting a traditional ballistic warhead and intercepting one of these newer maneuverable reentry vehicles, except instead of a ball moving at a walking pace, you're talking about an object descending at many times the speed of sound. And instead of a hand, you're talking about a multi-million-dollar interceptor that has to physically collide with the warhead to destroy it. A method commonly referred to as hit to kill, which leaves essentially zero margin for error even under ideal conditions. It's not just the Fatah family either. Iran's Khaybar-Shekan, first unveiled back in 2022, is solid-fueled with a maneuverable warhead, specifically built around the same evasion concept, capable of reaching targets over 1,400 kilometers away. And even older systems in Iran's arsenal, like the Qiyam, use a different approach entirely. A finless re-entry vehicle that strips away the aerodynamic surfaces that normally give radar systems a strong, trackable return, essentially a stealth-by-geometry approach rather than an active maneuvering one. Iran's been refining the Qiyam specifically against Saudi and Emirati air defenses through its involvement in the Yemen conflict going back to 2015, which means the IRGC entered this current war with real, accumulated operational experience in exactly how Western missile defense systems respond to that specific evasion technique, not something being tested for the very first time in the middle of this conflict. That accumulated operational history matters more than it might initially seem, because missile defense isn't just a hardware problem, it's also fundamentally a data and adaptation problem on both sides. Every single engagement, successful intercept or not, generates real information that both the defender and the attacker can learn from and incorporate into the next round of adjustments. Iran testing these evasion techniques against Gulf air defenses for close to a decade before ever using them directly against American systems. In this specific conflict means the IRGC likely arrived at this war with a meaningfully more mature understanding of exactly how these interceptor systems typically respond, what altitude bands they favor, how quickly their fire control systems recalculate against an unexpected maneuver, than they would have had if this were genuinely their first attempt at fielding this kind of technology under real combat conditions. It's also worth understanding how these different interceptor systems are actually supposed to work together, because Muwafaq Salti and bases like it don't rely on just one single layer of defense. Patriot batteries generally handle the lower altitude, closer in portion of an incoming missile's flight path, essentially the last line of defense before impact. THAAD is designed to engage higher up and further out, in that mid to upper atmosphere band, roughly between 40 and 150 kilometers in altitude, catching threats that are above what Patriot can effectively reach, but below where a system like Arrow 3 would typically prefer to operate. The entire concept behind layering these systems together is that if one layer misses, or if a specific missile's flight profile happens to fall into a gap between what two adjacent systems are each individually optimized for, another layer is still there to catch it. Reporting on Iranian targeting patterns during earlier phases of this broader conflict has actually suggested a deliberate strategy behind which specific missile types get used against which specific targets, conserving higher-end systems like the Fatah for a smaller number of harder, more defended targets, while expending larger volumes of older, less sophisticated systems like the Shahab and Zulfiqar early on, seemingly to help draw down an opponent's finite interceptor inventory over time before committing the more advanced, harder to stop weapons later in a given engagement. Window, a deliberate rationing strategy rather than simply firing everything available all at once. Quick thing before we go further, because I think the next part of this story is genuinely one of the more concerning threads running underneath the entire war. Follow now if you want to see exactly where these upgraded targeting capabilities reportedly seem to be coming from. because, as it turns out, it's not purely a story about Iran's own domestic engineering working in isolation. Here's where this gets more complicated and more concerning. According to reporting citing U.S. officials speaking to the Wall Street Journal, American intelligence officials are increasingly concerned that China and Russia are actively supporting Iran's improved targeting capabilities in this current phase of the war. Back on May 8th, the State Department issued sanctions against 3 Chinese satellite firms, specifically over their alleged role in Iranian strike planning. One of those companies, described in reporting as operating under the name Mizar Vision, was accused of using machine learning algorithms trained on commercially sourced satellite imagery, including imagery originally sourced from Western providers, to automatically identify and tag aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, fuel storage sites, and other high-value targets for Iranian strike planners. I want to be careful with how I present this specific piece, because it sits at a slightly different evidentiary level than the missile technology itself. The missile capability, high-speed, maneuverable terminal phase reentry vehicles, is directly documented and confirmed through Iran's own IRGC public statements and through direct physical evidence of missiles impacting their targets. The foreign intelligence and satellite support allegation is a real, formally sanctioned accusation from the U.S. government, not an unfounded rumor, but it remains an allegation about the specific supply chain and intelligence pipeline behind these strikes, not something independently verified through, say, a captured piece of hardware or a confirmed intercepted communication that's been made public. I want to walk through why this specific allegation carries real strategic weight, even setting aside the missile technology itself. Precision strike campaigns don't just require a capable weapon. They require accurate, timely targeting information, knowing exactly where a valuable target is sitting at a given moment, what kind of structure protects it, and ideally, coordinates precise enough that a maneuverable warhead's terminal guidance can actually lock onto it in those final critical seconds. If Iran genuinely has access to commercially sourced satellite imagery being processed through sophisticated machine learning systems specifically trained to automatically identify aircraft, hardened shelters, and fuel storage sites, that closes a meaningful gap between simply having an advanced missile and actually being able to reliably employ it against high-value targets buried inside a large defended airbase. That's part of why American officials appear to be treating this specific allegation with real seriousness, sanctioning 3 separate companies, rather than just issuing a general statement of concern, because the targeting intelligence side of a strike campaign is often just as operationally important as the missile technology carrying out the actual attack itself. Both things can be true and worth taking seriously, while still being honest that one sits on firmer, more directly demonstrated ground than the other. Let's shift now to the other half of this headline, the retaliatory strikes CENTCOM launched hitting Iranian infrastructure. Almost immediately after confirming the Jordan casualties, CENTCOM announced it was launching new airstrikes at President Trump's direction, explicitly framed as designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and, in the command's own stated language, to swiftly punish the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces behind the attack. This wasn't an isolated single night of retaliation either. It fits into a much larger, sustained campaign that's been building for weeks. Just days earlier, on July 12th, CENTCOM released footage appearing to show a precision strike destroying a loaded Iranian S-200 long-range surface-to-air missile launcher, part of a wider operation that hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets that same night, bringing the command's own stated cumulative total to more than 300 targets struck over just 3 consecutive nights at that point. That S-200 strike specifically matters because it shows this campaign has expanded beyond just offensive missile, drone, and naval targets into actively degrading Iran's own air defense network itself, presumably to reduce the risk to American aircraft, conducting further strikes deeper into the country going forward. That specific target is worth understanding a little more too, because the S-200 itself is a genuinely old system, originally a Soviet design going back decades, still fielded by Iran in a domestically produced version. Independent visual analysis of the released footage identified the target specifically through its distinctive rail-based missile handling infrastructure, the physical rails used to load and position missiles onto the launcher before firing. That detail actually points to a real structural vulnerability of this older generation of air defense system. Its fixed launch positions and supporting rail infrastructure are considerably easier to detect and target from the air than the road mobile launchers that more modern surface-to-air missile systems typically rely on. In other words, even as Iran's offensive missile technology has clearly been evolving in a genuinely sophisticated direction, some of its defensive air defense infrastructure is still built around a much older architecture that's considerably more exposed to exactly the kind of precision strikes CENTCOM has been carrying out. The tempo has genuinely escalated since then, too. Reporting indicates CENTCOM conducted the first daylight raids of this entire campaign on July 15th, a 90-minute morning wave hitting coastal defense and cruise missile positions on Greater Tump Island, followed by additional waves that same day reaching command centers, air defense sites, and coastal surveillance facilities. For the first time in this particular cycle of strikes, American forces reached genuinely far inland, hitting an Iranian mechanized brigade barracks at Iranshar, roughly 200 kilometers from the coast, reportedly killing 7 Iranian soldiers and wounding 13 more. Now here's where I want to slow down and be really precise, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened or spun depending on which source you're reading. CENTCOM has consistently characterized its target sets as military infrastructure, air defense systems, missile and drone storage, coastal surveillance, command centers, naval capability. Iranian state media, unsurprisingly, characterizes it very differently, with outlets like Press TV describing the campaign as deliberately targeting civilian facilities, specifically naming bridges and desalination plants, and using language like war crimes to describe it. I'm not going to simply repeat that characterization as settled fact, because Iranian state media has an obvious propaganda incentive here, but I'm also not going to pretend there's zero ambiguity in the actual reporting, because there genuinely is. According to independent tracking of this conflict, the campaign's effects reached power lines, bridges, and water systems across southern Iran, specifically during the window from July 16th through the 18th. Separately, and this is a detail worth sitting with, Iran struck a Kuwaiti power and desalination plant on July 18th. An independent analysis has suggested that strike was likely carried out in direct response to an alleged U.S. strike on an Iranian desalination plant near Jask a day earlier. Notably, American officials did not publicly confirm or deny that specific incident either way, and available reporting couldn't establish with certainty whether that particular facility was deliberately targeted or was damaged as unintended spillover from strikes on nearby military infrastructure that was part of CENTCOM's actual stated target list that night. So here's the honest, unresolved version of that specific thread. There's a real documented pattern of infrastructure beyond purely military hardware getting damaged on both sides of this conflict: power, water, and civilian facilities in southern Iran, and a Kuwaiti power and desalination plant hit in what looks like a direct hit for THAAD response. And what's genuinely not settled, at least not through anything I could independently verify, is whether any of that specific civilian-adjacent damage was deliberate targeting or incidental damage from strikes aimed at legitimate military infrastructure sitting nearby. I think it's worth explaining why this particular ambiguity matters so much more here than it might in other contexts. Under the international laws of armed conflict, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure like power generation and water desalination is treated fundamentally differently from incidental damage that occurs as a side effect of striking a legitimate, clearly military target located nearby. The first is generally considered a serious violation, the kind of thing that gets formally labeled a war crime in exactly the way Iranian state media has been using that term. The second, while still genuinely regrettable and something responsible, militaries are supposed to work hard to minimize through careful targeting and proportionality assessments, occupies a very different legal and moral category entirely. The problem for anyone trying to report on this honestly is that from the outside, without access to the specific targeting data, the precise coordinates struck, and the reasoning behind why a given aim point was selected, it's genuinely difficult to independently determine which category a specific incident like the Jask desalination plant actually falls into. That's not me trying to excuse anything. It's me being honest about the actual limits of what open source reporting can currently establish with confidence. That's a distinction that matters enormously under the laws of armed conflict. And it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when either side's messaging just flattens it into their preferred narrative. If you want to actually track how this specific infrastructure question develops going forward, because I genuinely think it's one of the more legally and morally significant threads running through this entire war, drop a comment with the word infrastructure below, and I'll build a dedicated follow-up specifically addressing that question once there's more independently verifiable reporting available to actually work with responsibly. There's also a broader diplomatic collapse worth understanding here, because it explains why this weekend's escalation happened when it did, rather than at some other point in the conflict. Iran's supreme leader and other senior Iranian officials, including members of Iran's own negotiating delegation, have now publicly declared that the Memorandum of Understanding signed back in June is no longer in effect at all. According to independent analysis of the negotiating breakdown, the United States and Iran ended up interpreting one specific clause of that agreement, the fifth clause, covering the Strait of Hormuz, in fundamentally different ways. And that specific disagreement is what ultimately contributed most directly to the entire memorandum collapsing. On top of that, Iran launched a ballistic missile at a U.S. base in Saudi Arabia this weekend as well, marking the first Iranian attack on Saudi territory in close to 3 months, which tells you this weekend's escalation wasn't narrowly contained to just the Jordan attack. It represents a broader widening of the conflict's geographic footprint happening essentially all at once. Let me unpack that Hormuz disagreement a bit further, because it's genuinely the diplomatic root of a huge amount of what we've discussed in this video. The June Memorandum's fifth clause dealt specifically with passage through the Strait of Hormuz, and according to independent analysis of the negotiating breakdown, the two sides walked away from that same signed document with meaningfully different understandings of exactly what it actually required going forward, how much authority Iran retained over inspecting or restricting traffic through the strait, versus how unrestricted that passage was supposed to become under the agreement's terms. That's not a minor wording dispute. It's a disagreement over the single most consequential practical mechanism in the entire agreement, control over the waterway, that a massive share of the world's oil exports depends on every single day. When two sides can't agree on what their own signed document actually means regarding the one clause that matters most practically, that's often a sign the underlying agreement was papering over a genuine, unresolved disagreement from the very beginning, rather than actually settling it. And disagreements like that tend to resurface exactly the way this one did. Let me give you my honest read on what all of this technical and strategic detail actually adds up to. The missile technology shift here is genuinely significant, and I don't think it should be downplayed. For months, American and Allied air defense systems in this region had established a reasonably strong track record against Iranian missile and drone attacks. This weekend's outcome, real American fatalities from an attack that specifically appears to have been enabled by improved terminal phase maneuverability, suggests that track record can't simply be assumed to continue unchanged going forward. Missile defense has always been a genuine cat and mouse dynamic. Every advance in interceptor technology eventually gets met with a corresponding advance in the offensive missile trying to defeat it. And what we watched play out at Muwafaq Salti this weekend looks like exactly that dynamic shifting, at least temporarily, back in the attacker's favor. There's a broader historical pattern worth mentioning here too, because this specific dynamic isn't unique to this conflict, or even to Iran specifically. Missile defense and offensive missile technology have been locked in exactly this kind of escalating back and forth since the earliest ballistic missile defense programs were first developed decades ago. Each meaningful advance on one side of that equation has historically been met, sooner or later, with a corresponding countermeasure from the other. What makes this particular moment notable isn't that the pattern itself is new, it's the specific combination of factors converging at once. A maneuverable reentry vehicle, genuinely difficult for current interceptor divert budgets to handle reliably, credible allegations of foreign satellite and intelligence support, improving targeting precision, and a sustained high-volume campaign on both sides that gives each new capability repeated real-world opportunities to actually get tested under live combat conditions rather than just in a controlled test environment. That combination is part of why officials and independent analysts covering this conflict have been treating this weekend's events as a genuine inflection point worth flagging specifically, rather than just another entry in an already long list of individual strikes and counterstrikes that have accumulated over the past several months of this war. I also think the retaliatory response tells you something important about where this conflict is heading in the near term, hitting 140 targets in a single night, expanding into daylight raids, reaching 200 kilometers inland for the first time this cycle, actively targeting Iran's own air defense network specifically. That's not a restrained, purely symbolic response to the Jordan attack. That's a sustained, escalating campaign that was already well underway before this weekend even happened, and this weekend's American casualties appear to have added real additional urgency and intensity on top of a tempo that was already climbing. Let me leave you with where things actually stand right now, stated as plainly and accurately as I can put it. Iran has demonstrated a real, documented improvement in its ability to defeat American and Allied missile defense systems through maneuverable reentry technology, a shift that directly contributed to American casualties this weekend for the first time since March. There's a credible, formally sanctioned allegation that China and Russia are supporting the intelligence and targeting side of that improved capability, though that specific piece remains an allegation rather than something independently verified beyond the sanctions action itself. CENTCOM has responded with an intensifying campaign against Iranian military infrastructure, including direct strikes on Iran's own air defense systems, while a genuinely unresolved question remains open about civilian-adjacent infrastructure damage on both sides of this conflict. And underneath the diplomatic collapse of the ceasefire memorandum, specifically over disagreement on Strait of Hormuz language, this weekend's events represent a real widening of the war's geographic scope, not just an isolated single incident. I want to add one more piece to that summary before we close, because I think it's genuinely the most useful single takeaway from everything we've covered. This weekend didn't happen because American air defense systems are somehow fundamentally broken or obsolete. Patriot and THAAD have compiled a real substantial track record of successful intercepts across this entire conflict up to this point. What happened is narrower and, in some ways, more specific than that. A particular combination of missile technology, possible foreign targeting support, and the underlying physics of how a hit-to-kill interceptor's divert budget works against a genuinely maneuverable target, all converging at once against a specific base on a specific night. Understanding that distinction matters, because the appropriate response isn't panic about the entire missile defense architecture failing. It's a clear-eyed recognition that this specific threat category has evolved, and that the systems and doctrine defending against it will very likely need to evolve again in response, the same way this entire technological back and forth has played out for decades before this particular conflict ever began. If this kind of breakdown helped you actually understand the technical and strategic reality sitting underneath a genuinely difficult weekend of news, share it with someone who's been following this war but might not understand exactly why this particular attack succeeded when so many previous ones over the past several months didn't. Because I think that specific piece of the story deserves to be understood clearly rather than lost in the broader noise. I want to close the way I opened. 2 American service members were killed in action this weekend, a third was killed in Iraq, and 1 more remains missing. Whatever happens strategically from here, whatever the technology or the politics or the ongoing retaliation campaign ultimately produces in the weeks ahead, that's the part of this story that actually matters most. And I didn't want to let the technical breakdown be the last word in this particular video. Thanks so much for sticking with something this heavy, for letting this stay honest about what's confirmed versus what's still developing. And I'll see you in the next breakdown. One last note before I let you go, and I mean this sincerely, rather than as some kind of scripted closing line. Stories like this one move fast, casualty figures get updated, missing status changes, remains get identified, retaliatory strikes keep happening night after night, and it's genuinely tempting for coverage of a fast-moving conflict like this one to treat each new development as just another data point in an ongoing scoreboard. I don't want to do that here. Behind every number in this video, 17 American fatalities total across this war, more than 430 wounded. Whatever the count ends up being by the time you're actually watching this, there are real families getting real devastating news they never wanted to receive, and no amount of technical analysis should ever be allowed to obscure that basic fact. I'll keep tracking the technical and strategic side of this conflict as carefully and honestly as I can, but I never want that to come at the cost of losing sight of what these numbers actually represent underneath all the analysis.